The touching moment, a shy woman stopped a millionaire's baby from crying on a flight. The cry started like a high, thin thread and then ripped through the cabin. It folded into itself, multiplied, and suddenly everything airborne, the fluorescent glare, the clipped breath of strangers, the low hum of the engines, was a stage for one small, unrelenting sound. Gustavo's cheeks were flushed, his fists, a toddler's protest, curled and uncurling. The man holding him looked as if he'd been hollowed out from the inside. He smoothed the boy's hair with hands that wore expensive watches, and the tiredness of someone who had learned to manage pain by scheduling it. Around them, the cabin rearranged itself into patterns of irritation. An executive in a tailored suit fumbled with earbuds. An elderly woman clutched a rosary, her mouth a thin line between pity and impatience. A man 3 rows back said something sharp under his breath. A flight attendant offered a practiced smile and a coupon for patience. For a few moments, the sound of the engines could not compete with the small human insistence that demanded attention. Fatima sat 3 rows back, a narrow woman with calloused hands and a nervous knot at the base of her throat. Her bag was plain, patched at the corner. The patch was from a hospital uniform she had once worn. She had boarded the flight with a resume folded carefully inside a notebook and a throatful of words she'd rehearsed until they curled into silence. She had never liked being visible. She laughed at herself sometimes for failing to meld into the background the way her mother taught her to. Be useful, not noticed, Donna Zilda had said, and Fatima had practiced usefulness like a prayer. Yet the cry pulled at her the way hunger pulls at the body. There was a habit in her, years of tending, the reflex of a palm tracing a fevered forehead, the memory of babies soothed on hot afternoons in a community clinic when there was no air conditioning, and all that separated comfort from chaos was a firm hand and a steady voice. She looked down at her hands. They trembled now not from fear, but from the quickness of recognition. This was a baby who needed something that wasn't a toy or an apology, but the small physics of touch and presence. She nearly stayed seated. Her shoulders went up and then down. She could be noticed. What if she were wrong? What if the father, already exhausted, snapped? What if it became an embarrassment? She pictured the interview she was going to, an opening at a São Paulo public health clinic where they took chances on people with grit and the right kind of patience. She had practiced her answers in the mirror. I work well under pressure. She thought of the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and Juliana, the way their Sunday dinners smelled of garlic and hope. Be useful, not noticed. Still, she stood. Her movements were small and unassuming. She crossed the aisle softly, as if not to startle the baby, and when she reached Marcelino's seat, she kept her eyes low, polite, not invasive. He looked up briefly, the corner of his mouth working as if to smile, but arrested by the weight he carried. He let her near without the ceremony of recognition. People like him were used to servers and assistants who arrived pre-instructed to defer. This woman did not defer. She settled beside the child and, with the ease of someone who had done this before, cupped a hand behind Gustavo's tiny head. "May I?" she asked, though the child did not belong to her. He nodded, slow, almost surprised by his own permission. The nod was small, as if he were trying to learn how to accept a help he had not imagined before. Fatima did not speak in clinical terms. She hummed. Her voice was thin at first, a barely audible vibration against the low thrum of the fuselage. She tilted the baby, supporting his jaw and cheeks so his sinus pressure might adjust, feeling that quick, humid breath against her wrist. She stroked the folds behind his ear with the pad of her thumb, in a way she had learned from older nurses at the community clinic. Gentle circles, a rhythm that mimicked the lull of a swing. She pressed a fingertip against the soft spot where the skull met the neck, not to probe, but to anchor, and then she shifted the way she held him so he faced the window, the plane's white light refracting off the plastic like a tiny sun. Her touch was ordinary and expert. It spoke of hands that had known the honest business of mending and easing without ceremony. She breathed with him, letting out a long exhale that matched the spaces between his wails. She ran a hand along his back, as if reading a line in a familiar book. When she found she was ready, she let her mouth shape a lullaby, something she'd heard from her grandmother, the melody without words, soft and repeating. It wasn't performed for the cabin. It was offered to a small human who, by the laws of infancy, had little tolerance for anything that did not promise relief. For seconds that felt like a private miracle. Nothing changed. The cry thinned, then broke into hiccups, then a single long sigh, and finally into a sound like sleep negotiations, grunts and tiny, gradually slowing breaths. A body relaxed. Cabin air, which had been full of judgment and static, smoothened into something like relief. The economy of the airplane shifted. A muffled exhalation from the seat behind became a laugh held back. The businessman dropped his phone. The flight attendant's practiced smile softened into genuine warmth. Marcelino's fingers, which had clenched white knuckles around a leather strap, loosened. When Gustavo finally gave in to quiet, he fell asleep against Fatima's chest, a small head that smelled of milk and warmth. She placed him back into Marcelino's arms with a gentleness that was precise. She lifted the blanket with the care of someone who knew the difference between tucking and smothering. Marcelino looked at her as if he were seeing someone who could read a map of trouble. "You're a nurse?" he asked, his voice graveled by fatigue. "A nursing technician," she corrected, her voice small. She did not want him to think she was more than what she was. Competence, not grandstanding, had always been Fatima's creed. "I work in community health. We see a lot of babies like this." You calmed him down, quickly. He offered gratitude in an economy that hinted at how unused he was to human kindness that didn't come with an agenda. "Thank you," she shrugged, an instinctive attempt to minimize the attention. Her cheeks warmed. She was not used to being thanked by men like him, men who gave instructions and signs and had money that glinted clean and hard. She scanned him briefly. The lines at the corners of his eyes, a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, a watch she recognized from glossy magazine spreads. Then she looked at the baby again and felt the involuntary tug of maternal tenderness. A dangerous thing, she thought, because it stitched together strangers with expectations and liabilities. "You must be tired," she said instead. And it was both observation and an offering, permission to be human. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh, if not for the memory he carried. "You mean more than tired," Marcelino said. "I haven't slept properly since the funeral." It was the first time the word left his mouth in any public place. It hung between them quietly, a note that invited no pity, only the acknowledgement of a wound. For an instant, they both sat with that small private truth. Fatima's hands were still warm from the child. Marcelino's fingers felt very big when they took Gustavo's. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in the simple human way she had learned to mean things. She did not offer platitudes. She offered a presence. Marcelino looked at her with an almost scholarly interest then, as if cataloguing a specimen of kindness. "Do you have children?" "No." She shook her head. When she thought of children, she saw the photographs on her mother's fridge. Juliana, her niece, running in a patch of sunlight. A small boy at the clinic who had refused to eat for 3 days until a nurse sang him a made-up song. The word "no" tasted like a closed door and an open ache. "Would you mind if I gave you my card?" he asked, as if the act might absolve him of something larger. "Not because I want anything in return, just if you ever want to reach out about pediatric resources, contacts, anything." She looked at the card when he extended it. A thick stock, embossed name, 2 lines of numbers, an understated emblem. She almost refused. Not out of pride as she imagined. She had known hunger and pride at the same time, but because accepting help from a man with a public life felt like trespassing into a different language. She thought of her mother's voice, a low, practical sound. If someone opens a door, step inside and don't let it slam in your face. She slid the card into her notebook without fanning her reaction. "Thank you," she said. Her gratitude was small. It fit in the pocket where she kept her careful hopes. A man behind them cleared his throat. Fatima straightened, fighting the relief that bloomed like light in her chest. Around them the cabin took on its ordinary drama again. A child on vacation, a woman with a sleeping mask that suggested exhaustion, a man reading a financial report. The world resumed its rhythms, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. When the seatbelt sign blinked off and the announcements for descent began, they exchanged a few more words. Marcelino asked where she was headed. She offered São Paulo, an answer that was true and thin. He mentioned an address in Pinheiros that his assistant had recommended for short-term stays, and she filed the name in the mental cabinet where she kept logistics. A possible roof, a potential way to get her to the interview without missing the bus. He told her the baby's name, Gustavo, and said it like someone who spoke the name to keep it tethered to life. They stepped off the plane into the strange new gravity of arrival. The smell of reheated coffee, the low carpeted thud of many footsteps, the roll of carts loaded with luggage. Outside, a São Paulo afternoon was bright and functional. They paused on the jet bridge. Neither seemed eager to rush into the anonymity of the terminal. "Are you staying in the city?" he asked, as if to anchor the thin thread of conversation. "For a week," she said. "Maybe more if you get the job?" Marcelino finished. He did not put expectation in the sentence. He merely completed it. She laughed, a single quick sound that was almost a sob. "If I get the job." He hesitated, then said, "If you need someone to hold a bag or point you to a good cafe, text me." He looked at her for a beat longer than necessity required, and in that glance she saw something else. Curiosity, the small disarming of someone who, despite privilege, had been reminded how thin the surroundings of his life could be. She tucked his number deeper into her phone than the paper card, somewhere not to be flaunted, but to be used with discretion. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was more steadiness. They parted with the quiet clumsiness of strangers who had become, if not friends, then witnesses to each other's moment. Marcelino lifted a stroller gently, as if he were carrying something fragile and important. Fatima watched him go, cataloguing his profile. How he moved with economy, how he eased his shoulders, as if the currency of grief was weight itself. She thought of the baby in his arms, and the way a tiny hand curled around his finger. She thought also of the thin line between charity and autonomy. She had no intention of being rescued. She wanted an opening, not a safety net stitched with obligation. The terminal swallowed them into separate crowds. She found herself back in the corridor with her small bag, her notebook, the card that smelled faintly of new paper. Her phone vibrated once, then twice. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Gustavo slept like a champ after you sang to him. Thank you. M." It was the kind of message that could mean anything. It made her palms damp. She texted back with the kind of brevity she used in the waiting room of the clinic. "Glad he's resting. Best wishes for your trip." He replied with a heart and a short line about travel. Nothing gilded. She saved the string of messages, then hid the phone in the lining of her bag, as if to tuck away a secret. The city that afternoon felt different. The plan that had been a single, bright hinge in her life, an interview at a public health post in the east of the city, suddenly bore the weight of the encounter. She wondered if anyone on her street could imagine her walking across the terminal, flanked by people who smelled of perfume and power. She imagined her mother, hearing the story over dinner. Juliana's eyes widening. She imagined their small apartment, lit with the quick warmth of possibility. She did not call to boast. She sat at a bench under a bank of glass and watched people move like flocks, all circling their private weather. She pulled her notebook from her bag again and smoothed the page where she had written directions. Her hands traced the ink. Some lines were notes, others small prayers disguised as practicalities. Bring ID, speak of community work, mention immunization record-keeping. The reminder of her own competence steadied her. She had done this kind of work for years, filling forms, calming mothers, convincing the suspicious that a vaccine could be an act of love. The job was not glamorous. It was necessary. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcelino. If you ever want to know good spots for coffee near Pinheiros, I can recommend a place. They make a mean pão de queijo. The mention of pão de queijo made her laugh out loud, surprising herself. The sound turned heads. A woman with a loud laugh at the airport is an exotic thing. She texted back a simple, "Thanks," and then tucked the device away. A small kindness from a stranger had multiplied in her chest into a quiet light. Night came wrapped in the rumble of the city. She took the bus to a hostel that smelled of detergent and new sheets, a place where posters of plays and cheap restaurants flapped in the entrance. She climbed the narrow stairs to the room with a roommate already asleep, her face lit by the blue glow of a phone. Fatima lay back on a thin mattress and turned her attention inward. Tomorrow she would wake early, memorize the route to the clinic, and practice answers that proved both competence and compassion. She would not lie about who she was, about the daughter of Donna Zilda, the woman who stitched up the knees of neighborhood children and managed to love them on an empty stomach. She would tell them plainly that she wanted to work where people needed someone who stayed when things were hard. She slept in that way that is both deep and fragmentary, a mind that mends itself in pieces. She dreamed of airplane songs and tiny fists and the weight of a sleeping child on her chest. In the dream, a bright hand handed her a key and then disappeared. She woke with the key warm in her palm, and it took her a beat to remember that it was just a dream. The morning was humid and metallic. She rode the subway with the small throng of people who read quietly on their phones, their faces lit by morning news. She rehearsed lines in her head, and without planning it, hummed the lullaby from the plane beneath her breath. The melody steadied her. She held the card Marcelino had given her like a talisman, not to wield, but to accept as a proof that some strangers were unexpectedly kind. When she stepped off at the station near the health post, she felt her stomach flip, an anxious, useful flip. The building where the interview would be held was not an impressive edifice. It was a functional box of glass and concrete, with paint flaking at the corners, a place honed by public need rather than aesthetics. The waiting area smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee. Two women at the receptionist desk looked up and offered practiced smiles. For a moment, Fatima felt very conspicuous, a plain woman with a clean uniform folded into a satchel. She waited in a row of chairs that had seen countless applicants come and go, middle-aged men with earnest faces, young women with neat bun hairstyles, a man with a resume thick as a book. She clutched her folder. Inside were certificates, a list of vaccination schedules she had helped manage, and a small photograph of her mother beaming with a hat about to fall off. She reviewed her notes: community outreach, immunization records, education programs for mothers. She had a short list of instances where she had persevered through chaos, how she'd stayed overnight with a mother on the verge of losing a baby because of dehydration, how she'd negotiated with reluctant fathers to bring children for follow-up visits. She did not exaggerate. In the health post, honesty was more persuasive than any glibness. While she waited, her phone vibrated. A message from Marcelino popped up. "Good luck, breathe." Her fingers hovered over the screen for a suspiciously long time before she typed back, "Thank you, I will." The first interview called her name. She calmed her breathing the way she had been taught to calm a fever, gentle, measured, an awareness of rhythm. Her hands did not tremble like they had on the plane, though small butterflies beat in her stomach. She told herself she earned a place at the table, and that the table did not care where one came from, only what one could offer. When they called her name, Fatima de Almeida, she stood and smoothed her skirt. The room she entered had a long table and 3 faces. One woman, the director, wore a badge that read Dr. Elisa Mendes. Her expression was professional, not unkind. Another was a nurse who looked like she had worked nights and would do it again without complaint. The third, a woman with a practical haircut, smiled in a way that suggested she wanted the system to work as much as she wanted good coffee. They did not ask her to perform theatre. They asked direct questions about schedules, about how she handled parents who were afraid of shots, about a time she had had to be resourceful. She answered with small stories. A time she used a borrowed car to reach a home in the rain. A time she sat in a doorway and explained, with a voice that didn't judge, why a vaccine mattered. She described how she kept records, meticulous, practical details that mattered in a clinic where memory alone could not be trusted. As she answered, she felt something shift inside the room, an honest recognition, not pity, a respect that accumulated like small coins in a jar. "Your references are strong," Dr. Elisa said, tapping a pen against a clip. "You've worked in our kind of environment before." "Yes," Fatima said. "I've been with the community health team for over 3 years. We did home visits, vaccination campaigns, prenatal follow-ups." They asked about her weaknesses. She spoke of impatience with bureaucracy and of the quiet fear that came when supplies ran low. She did not paint herself as flawless. She offered dedication and a readiness to learn. When she left the room, her palms were damp, but her neck felt less burdened. Outside, the hospital courtyard smelled of grilled coffee and dry leaves. She sat on a bench and exhaled so long she felt the air leave her body like a physical token. Her phone chimed. Another message from Marcelino. "How did it go?" he had written. She typed back honestly, "It felt good. Pretty sure I didn't say anything too foolish." He replied with a few words and a small emoji that made her look around as if she had said something bold enough to register universally. She smiled at the brightness in her chest. The exchange was small, nothing like a bond forged in melodrama, but enough to feel like human warmth. She walked back to the bus stop with the lightness of someone who had done something at least partly right. On the way, she stopped at a kiosk and bought an empadinha, small pastry that tasted like the comfort of home. She ate it slowly, savoring each piece in a way that allowed her to measure the day by small pleasures. Later, in the hostel, she sat at the narrow table with the rest of the residents and tried to do something mundane: fold laundry, make a list. She kept finding her fingers going to the pocket where she had placed Marcelino's card. She turned it over in her hands and read the name again, Marcelino de Carvalho, a man constructed of public headlines and private loss, a father whose son cried the day a shy woman stepped across an aisle. As evening settled, a message lit up her phone with an image, a small hand, Gustavo's, wrapped around a finger. The caption was simple: "He approves, M." It made her laugh, the kind of soft sound that woke the roommate in the next bed. She texted back a small note, "Glad to hear. Good night." Then she put the phone away and turned the room dark. Her dreams were less jagged than the night before. The lullaby she had hummed on the plane looped in her mind, a soft reel of melody that seemed to steady time itself. Morning arrived with an email. "Thank you for attending the interview. We will be in touch." It was the standard form of provisional hope, an official container for possibility. She read it and read it again, trying to coax a sign from its neutral tone. She made herself a promise. She would not hang her fate on a single message. She would continue to apply elsewhere, to show up where work was needed. she would be steady. Still, the card in her notebook sat like a tiny hinge. She found herself imagining what might happen if she ever used it. She imagined an apartment with a window that faced a small park, a place where she and her mother could eat together with the light on the table. She imagined Gustavo's laugh crossing a lawn. The images were dangerous because they felt real. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was not a message, but a little video. Marcelino, in a quick clip, crouched in his kitchen with Gustavo wobbling on his knees, trying to clap. The man's suit had been traded for a simple sweater. His laughter was private and warm. He looked at the camera and said something she could not hear because the baby screeched with delight. He typed, "We landed. Thank you again. If you ever want to know a good place to drink coffee, I mean it." She stared at the video, then at the ceiling. The world outside her window was a city that breathed and moved without asking permission. Fatima felt the pulse of something like possibility. She did not reply immediately. She had learned to manage small hopes with caution, but she saved the video anyway, tucked it between the pages of her notebook where it could be found like a bookmark for the future. 2 days later, a phone call came. The number at the top of the screen was from the health post. Her heart lurched in the way she had learned to when a patient's chart flickered with an unexpected entry. "We'd like to offer you the position," Dr. Elisa's voice said, steady and clear. She had a tone that suggested this was not a favor, but an arrangement based on need and competence. Fatima's throat closed. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time she let herself say the phrase with a weight behind it. She accepted the schedule offered, the modest salary, the start date. The job was hers, not because of the card in her pocket, not because of a millionaire who had been kind on a plane, but because she had shown up and the people in power decided she had the right balance of experience and heart. Still, she wanted to tell Marcelino, not to owe him anything, but to close the loop of kindness. She typed, "They offered me the job." Her hands trembled. She considered whether to say more. Would he think it presumptuous? She added, "Thank you for the coffee recommendation. You made the flight easier." His reply was almost immediate. "That's wonderful. Congratulations. You earned it." The words, "you earned it," sat in her chest like a small, unexpected sun. Merit felt better when given by someone who was not close to her. It carried a different, cleaner weight. She walked the city that afternoon with the paper that confirmed her start date tucked into her pocket, feeling the way a person feels when temperature changes slowly and you realize you might need a lighter jacket. A few hours later, a message arrived, this time not from the number, but a short email with a calendar invite. "Coffee, tomorrow 3 p.m. Casaron Café, Pinheiros." Marcelino's name was attached in the subject line. She read it twice and then 3 times. A coffee could be a simple courtesy. She thought of her mother's practical voice. Go, learn who he is. His money is not an instruction. It's a man with a child and a scar. The voice made sense and made her feel braver in a way that was not showy. She agreed. The city hummed on as if little had altered, but in the small interior of her life, days began to bend to accommodate the small new tasks. Buying a set of clean blouses, tightening the straps on her bag so it would not make noise in a cafe, measuring the path to Pinheiros in her head. She rehearsed nothing, because honesty had been her best strategy. She would be herself, a woman who had learned to soothe infants, to stitch up scraped knees, to show up when others faltered. That night, she packed a small thermos of hope into the compartment where she kept things that might be useful later. The thermos was metaphorical. What she actually packed was a pair of comfortable shoes and the card with the palm print of a man she barely knew. When she fell asleep, the lullaby returned. Not the airplane melody, but a new looping strain. Part memory, part future. Somewhere in the city an infant slept with his cheek pressed to the softness of a man's chest. unaware that his silence had opened a new possibility in a woman who had been raised to be useful and not noticed. Fatima lay with her mind alight with 1,000 small plans. She did not know yet where the coffee would lead, whether it might become a friendship or something different. All she knew was the undeniable fact that a small act, one lonely, practiced lullaby, had altered the course of a week, and perhaps, if fate was kind, the course of lives. The next day arrived with clear light and a slight wind. She walked to Pinheiros with the caution of someone who understood that ordinary moments could be charged. The café was a modest place with plants at the windows and a barista who folded milk with particular attention. When she opened the door and smelled the coffee, the memory of the airplane was near enough to touch. The hush after the cry, the surprised faces, the thin line between strangers and allies. He was already there when she entered, sitting at a small table near the plants, hands wrapped around a cup. He had opted for casual clothes, jeans and a sweater that shrank him from the grandeur of a headline figure into someone softer. Gustavo slept in a slung carrier beside him, dreams crossing the baby's face in tiny, harmless ways. Marcelino's expression shifted when he saw her, not the performative interest of a man advertising a life, but the sincere surprise of someone who is glad to see a familiar face in an unfamiliar context. "Fatima," he said simply. She returned the greeting. The air between them had a new quality, less charged now by the drama of an airplane and more by the comment of two people deciding whether they would like to see one another again. They ordered coffee. They spoke in sentences that were ordinary and therefore honest. He asked about her new job offer with a curiosity that caused no spotlight to fall upon her. She asked in return about the baby, about how he was adjusting to life in a world that could be loud and confusing. It was the sort of conversation that did not rush toward anything notable. It was an exchange of small truths, favorite foods, the particular irritation of bureaucracy, the name of a street vendor who made the best pastel in a part of town they both visited. The baby stirred occasionally and then returned to sleep, the cafe's low music acting as a gentle metronome. They laughed a few times, lightly, about things neither would have expected to laugh at an hour earlier. The laughter felt like a shared map, a way of navigating an unfamiliar territory. When the coffee cooled, they rose. Marcelino walked her to the door, and for a single moment their hands brushed, a brief contact that was conscious on both sides, and ended with a mutual, unspoken understanding that touch could happen without promise. They parted with the casualness of two people who had enjoyed a pleasant hour and might, if life permitted, enjoy others. She walked back through streets that seemed slightly less anonymous. Her steps had the speed of someone who possesses a small but expanding field. The card stayed in her pocket, warm from the day. The message of the morning, "You earned it," settled into a rhythm that convinced her to look beyond the immediate need for wages. She thought of Gustavo, of Marcelino's tiredness, of the way a lullaby had soft-penned an opening. That night she wrote in her notebook, "Not a plan, but an inventory. Start date, new uniform, budget for transport, call mother." Each item took up a line, and each line felt like a rung on a ladder. She closed the notebook and read a paragraph from a book she loved, letting her mind quiet into the domestic, ordinary act of reading. She did not yet know that the card in her pocket would be more than a token. She did not yet know where the coffee would lead, or whether the job would change everything. She knew only that a single act, stepping forward when others stepped back, had altered the immediate future. She slept with the thought like a soft stone placed in her palm, testing its fit. The next morning, a text arrived that she did not expect. "Would you like to come by for a quick orientation? We need someone who can start sooner if possible. Dr. Elisa." Her breath hitched. The message meant logistics, shifts, training, but it also meant something emotionally enormous, doors ajar in practical ways. She replied with the efficiency that had come to feel like dignity. "Yes, I can come today." She packed a small bag and set out, not knowing the shape of how this new life would contour her days, not yet reading the full map. In her chest, a soft promise hummed, a melody not unlike the lullaby from the plain, of steady, honest work and the hush that comes after a child's cry. She walked toward the bus stop, phone in hand, the city moving around her as if nothing had happened. But for Fatima, everything had begun. A small kindness had opened a sequence of events she could not yet name, and she felt the tense, feral hope of someone stepping onto a new path. She walked toward the bus stop, phone in hand, the city folding around her like a map she was finally learning to read. The card in her pocket felt less like a talisman and more like an ordinary fact. A man she'd helped on a plane had left a number. That was all it needed to be. A fact, a possibility, a tiny hinge. If this quiet kind of story touches you, please give the video a like. It helps more people find small, human moments like this. At the health post, orientation was an exercise in practical mercy. Dr. Elisa led it like she led everything, without fanfare, with a directness that made room for competence. She showed Fatima where the vaccines were kept, how the inventory log was tallied, and the protocol for home visits. Knock, announce yourself, remove shoes if the family asked, bring juice for small children if the climate required it. The rules were not exhaustive prescriptions. They were instruments designed to shape care into habit. Nurse Teresa was a mountain of quiet efficiency. She introduced the newcomers with a nod and an unhurried kindness that felt like a small shelter. Her voice had the cadence of someone who'd seen generations pass through the clinic, and her eyes crinkled when Fatima mentioned the plane. "So you sang on a plane," Teresa said. The sentence landed like a short story. "You should have told me. We could use someone with nerves like that." Fatima wanted to say that it wasn't nerves, only habit, and that habits can be taught by people who have had to invent comforts out of scarcity. She said instead, "I just wanted the baby to stop crying." Teresa's mouth made a line that might have been a smile. That's enough reason. The first days were an array of small demands. A baby with a fever who needed cooling measures and calm reassurance. A mother who distrusted injections because of a cousin's story. A toddler who hid behind a curtain and needed a game, not an interrogation, to be coaxed out. Fatima moved through them like someone comfortable with the particular gravity of another person's panic. She took vital signs, filled in forms, and sat with mothers in motionless chairs until the tears slowed and the words began again. Each successful pause was quiet evidence that she belonged. Between shifts, she rode the city like a commuter with a map and a purpose. The bus was crowded with people who had their own precise worries, bills to pay, children to pick up, bosses to answer to, and in that crowd, Fatima felt oddly less conspicuous. Work made her visible in a way she could own. Marcelino's messages continued, polite and infrequent. Sometimes a photo of Gustavo mid-yawn, sometimes a link to an article that made him think of public health. He never pushed. When he asked how she was settling in, the question felt less like a spotlight and more like a check-in. It was the way a neighbor might ask after a new tenant's first night. Practical, not possessive. Once, on an afternoon when rain came sudden and bright, Marcelino sent a message. "I'll be in the area tomorrow morning. If you're free, could I drop by the clinic? No expectations, just to see how things look." The invitation was careful. Fatima hesitated. Her mother's voice in her ear warned against accepting favors that felt like strings. But then she also remembered how Dr. Elisa had said the clinic could use advocates with influence, donors, parents who could open grant doors. If he came and simply observed, it might be useful for the clinic's visibility. She told him he could come for a brief visit. He arrived before 9, a plain car pulling up that contradicted none of the rumors and none of the headlines. He walked into the clinic, not as a man in a costume, but as someone who had become, through circumstance, intensely familiar with tenderness. Gustavo was with him, now a little larger and able to focus on faces without panic. The baby took a cautious interest in the bright stickers on the wall, and then, satisfied, returned his small palm to Marcelino's finger. Marcelino spoke with Dr. Elisa about logistics, possible partnerships, a foundation that had supported immunization campaigns in other cities. His language around the clinic was measured. He asked questions, listened, and deferred to practical voices. When he listened, the room's energy shifted. He had influence, but not at the expense of agency. He closed the visit with a simple, "If there's anything I can help with, let me know," and left his card again, this time for the administration. For Fatima, the visit was instructive. She saw how wealth could be arranged as a resource, limited, useful, and not miraculous. She saw how a polite hand could open a window without demanding the space behind it. It felt like an extension of the plane incident, kindness that did not require her to trade herself for it. Work made demands that no amount of goodwill could erase. One night a call came in about a family 3 neighborhoods over. No water, a child with a cough that would not relent. The clinic did not have enough time or cars to get to everyone. They relied on rotations and favors. Fatima volunteered despite the late hour. She found the boy's mother on the stoop, hair wet from worry, explaining that the municipality's truck had been delayed. Fatima knelt and listened to the cough, then set a simple protocol: steam, hydration, and instruction for when to return. She left the family with a sense of being seen. On her way back, Marcelino called. He had no obligations to call, and yet there he was, asking softly, "Are you all right?" She thought of how tired she was, the ache under her shoulder blades that came from leaning into life for others. She could have told him it was fine. Instead, she said, "Honestly, I'm tired, but it's what I do." "Then rest when you can," he replied. "And if the clinic needs anything, supplies, anything, tell me." She heard the offer for what it was. Not salvation, not an erasure of need, but a possibility of concrete help. She filed it away under logistics and thanked him. "Thank you," she said. "We'll let you know." Things at the clinic settled into a rhythm. Fatima became the woman who remembered the best time to call a mother back, or which child would respond to a song. She kept her head down and her hands busy. People began to ask for her by name. A mother left a small sachet of coffee beans in the supply room as thanks. A grandmother brought over empanadas the day Fatima stayed late. Gratitude was quiet. It often came wrapped in modest packages. When a small local donor offered to fund an outreach day, Dr. Elisa asked Fatima to lead the scheduling. It was an acknowledgement that had nothing to do with a man's card and everything to do with competence. She worked evenings to coordinate volunteers, printed schedules, and on the day of the campaign saw dozens of children vaccinated and dozens of mothers reassured. Standing in the middle of that bustle, she felt the particular pleasure of being useful in public. Marcelino watched from the edge. He showed up with a thermos and with Gustavo strapped on his chest, and he handed out juice to parents with the sort of clumsy grace that revealed how much practice he had with being present and still unfamiliar with being ordinary in public life. He shadowed the work without hovering. He voted with his presence and retreated when it was clear the team did not need his hands. After that afternoon, as people were cleaning up, he approached Fatima and said simply, "You handled that well." She shrugged as if the compliment belonged somewhere else. "It was a team effort," she said, meaning it. "Merit had many hands." He smiled as if relieved he had not overstepped. "I admire that," he said. The months that followed were not a montage of perfect scenes, but a slow rearrangement of days. Fatima kept her small apartment, sent money home to her mother, and began to dream not of wealth, but of the kind of stability that pays for a plumber, and sometimes, unexpectedly, for a new pair of shoes. She cultivated routines, the same bus stop, the same bench near the clinic where she ate her lunch, the same lullaby that she hummed under her breath when needed. Marcelino and she exchanged messages that gradually lost the stiffness of acquaintanceship. He would send a photo of Gustavo discovering a new toy. She would reply with a short, approving emoji. Then came the picnic, the thing that in the small theater of their lives felt more like a risk than a romance. They met on a Sunday at Ibirapuera Park, a time when the light softened and the heat allowed the city to breathe. Marcelino arrived with a small blanket, a basket that smelled faintly of cheese, and a careful plan to do nothing more than enjoy the day. Gustavo, now crawling with a hesitant confidence, found trouble in the grass and joy in a blade that stuck against his fingers. The park hummed with life. A man practicing flute under a tree, teenagers teaching a dog new tricks, bicycles marking a line of motion across the lawn. The air held the scent of the lake and the faint oil of street food. Fatima felt oddly exposed and oddly safe. There was a bench beneath a stand of trees where they sat, and for the first hour conversation was small. Observations, a few jokes about missing pastry stands, talk of the clinic's next outreach day. At some point, the mood eased into something tender. Marcelino spoke about the small things he had learned about time since his wife's death. How silence could become a loud presence, how mornings had to be repopulated with tasks that defined a day. He did not speak in metaphors about healing. He spoke of diapers, of late-night searches for lost pacifiers, of the way a baby's small thumb could make a fist and transform an aching hand into a shelter. The arithmetic of everyday care came through his words like currency. Fatima, in turn, confessed her fears. The fear of losing dignity when asking for help, the tiny terror of imagining her life dependent on someone else's generosity. Her tone was practical, not theatrical. "I don't want to be a charity case," she said. "I want to be a colleague." He listened and heard the distance she kept between gratitude and obligation. When she finished, she said softly, "I wouldn't expect anything different." They walked along a path edged with jacaranda trees, Gustavo toddling between them with a steady fascination for the world. At one point he fell, knees scraping the ground, and Fatima moved before he did. She picked him up with the same practiced gentleness that had quieted a plane cabin months before. The baby's mouth made the small sound of consolation, then recognition, then pure delight at being restored to warmth. For a moment their eyes met. Marcelino's an honest, bewildered gratitude. Fatima's the shy steadiness of someone who knew how to give care without losing herself. The park around them seemed to hold its breath. It was a quiet kind of cliff. Two people who lived in separate orbits leaning toward one another because the physics of grief and kindness had formed a brief field. They sat on the blanket until the light turned gold, and then the conversation shifted into terms that resembled a negotiation of boundaries. Marcelino, careful as a man stepping on ice, offered help that was practical and temporary. "I have an apartment above my office," he said. "It's empty for a while. My assistant offered it to me as a short-term place when I'm in the city. If you ever need a roof for a few weeks while things settle, just until you get your feet under you, I could let you stay. No strings. It's a stopgap, nothing more." Fatima listened. She understood the offer for what it was, an opening, not a rewrite of her life. Her first instinct was to refuse. Pride had been her companion longer than comfort, but she also thought of long rides home after night shifts, of the buses that ran late and the stairs that never seemed to end. She looked at Marcelino's face and saw that he meant what he said. Practical help, offered without ceremony. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I need to be clear. I'm not looking for a rescue. If I accept, it's because it helps me care for my mother and to get to work. It won't change how I do things." He nodded, a small motion that seemed to include relief. "Of course," he said. "I would never want you to feel otherwise. You have my address if you want it." They did not kiss at the picnic. The day did not call for a grand scene. What happened instead was a soft hand placed on another hand, the sort of gesture that asks permission before moving forward. And then another gesture, this one mutual, a tilt of the head, a small reciprocal leaning. When they finally did kiss, it was at another moment, later and quieter. They walked toward the car as the sun dropped. On the park's edge, a child ran past them chasing pigeons, a burst of public joy. Marcelino stopped and turned to Fatima. "May I?" he asked, a man asking consent rather than assuming it. The question was simple. The consent was mutual. Their first kiss was nothing cinematic in the way movies imagine such things. It was a careful, honest meeting that respected their histories and acknowledged their fears. It lasted a whisper of time and then ended, as all beginnings do, with a small laugh and an intake of air. Gustavo, then only a foot or two away, gurgled as if to provide a verdict, a high, delighted sound that made both of them grin. That evening, after the park and the farewells, Fatima walked home in a hush she could not name. The city's lights had a different quality now, less anonymous, more like windows into stories that might, if tended, open to a shared room. A week after the picnic, Marcelino followed up with a practical offer. He wrote an email to Dr. Elisa and copied Fatima. "There is an apartment available, as I mentioned. It's close to Pinheiros and useful for short stays. No strings. If it helps logistics for the clinic or for Fatima's commute, perhaps it can be of assistance for a time." The email was scrupulously neutral. Dr. Elisa replied with administrative clarity, "We will coordinate. Any arrangement will be formalized and temporary to avoid conflicts of interest. The clinic supports mobility for staff. Thank you, Mr. de Carvalho." For Fatima, the apartment was a logistical solution folded into a web of caution. She met with Marcelino's assistant twice to see the space, a neat, modest studio with good light and a small kitchenette. It was not luxury, it was a relief. She discussed details with her mother and with Juliana, who declared that an occasional hot shower in peace was worth more than any ceremony. They agreed that she would stay temporarily, no more than 3 months, while payroll and transportation patterns settled. The arrangement was formalized with paperwork, a temporary occupancy agreement that detailed duration and conditions. Integrity was preserved, dignity not bartered. The first night in the apartment, she lay awake, listening to sounds that were not hers. Far-off traffic, the rustle of leaves against the window. She thought of how different it was to sleep in a place that belonged momentarily to her. She felt unmoored and grounded in the same breath. She called her mother and told her the address. Donna Zilda's voice was practical, pleased, and quick to suggest what dishes Fatima should make first. "Bring me now all the utensils you lack," her mother said, the command a sort of blessing. Work at the clinic continued, and with the new commute came new small pleasures. A bus that left earlier so she could sit and read, a market on the corner where the vendor knew the way she liked her cassava. She began to keep a small notebook titled Shifts and Notes, in which she tracked things like inventory, patient follow-ups, and occasionally the odd detail of life. Marcelino smiled without a headline. Gustavo likes to bite crusts. It was proof that life, if stewarded, could be tender. Days opened into months with the steady rhythm of care. Some mornings Marcelino would come by with fresh fruit and stay to chat with the staff. Other days he would arrive tired and retreat to his car. The relationship between them became a cord with knots, an acknowledgement that while attraction and affection were real, they existed in a complex space that included grief, responsibility, and professional life. Neither tried to rush the other. One afternoon, when the clinic was unusually quiet, a call came. A mother had gone into labor at home and needed urgent guidance while help was summoned. Dr. Elisa was busy at a meeting. Fatima took the call and talked the woman through the contractions, her voice steady and calm. She coached breathing, encouraged slow pushes, and held the woman with words across the wire until an ambulance arrived. Later, when they followed up, the baby was healthy and the mother grateful. It was one of those invisible victories that stitch a life together. Competence recognized not with fanfare, but with trust. That evening, Marcelino sent a message. "I heard about the call. You handled that well. Are you coming in for dinner tomorrow? No pressure, just if you'd like to." The message was both an offer of company and an observation of the life they had come to share. Both caring and curiosity, without claim. She accepted. Dinner was simple. They cooked together in Marcelino's apartment, a clumsy choreography of chopping and shared anecdotes. He admitted that he still could not manage more than a few things at once without becoming anxious. She admitted that she sometimes feared losing herself in expectations. There were confessions, small and honest, that did not require dramatic framing. Over jasmine tea and a rice dish, they spoke of the practicalities of parenting, of how grief could be a private companion, no matter how public the rest of your life was. Outside the window, the city hummed. Inside, the night held an ordinary comfort. They did not rush toward declarations. There were smiles, a period of comfortable silence when Gustavo fell asleep on the couch, and a moment when Marcelino brought his hand to Fatima's, in what felt like a rehearsal for future intimacies. She allowed it, not because she needed a rescuer, but because she wanted to connect. Weeks later, as the temporary agreement with the apartment approached its end, they both met the question of next steps with practicality. Marcelino reiterated that the offer had always been temporary, and that he respected her independence. "If you want to keep it longer, we can talk about a lease through your name and the clinic's advocacy," he suggested. Fatima considered it. She imagined having a stable place without an expiration that felt like a ticking clock. She also imagined the responsibilities that would multiply with a lease in her name. In the end, she chose a middle path. She renewed the temporary agreement for another 3 months, and used that time to find a modest studio near the clinic, one with a small balcony and a landlord who preferred tenants who worked in public service. It was not luxurious. It was a practical anchor. Marcelino respected the decision and helped only as a friend. He recommended a lawyer to review the lease and offered a reference for the landlord to confirm her employment. Again, no strings, only logistics. The way they navigated their relationship became its own testament to the theme that had tied them together from the plane: kindness without condition, help without expectation, affection that did not erase agency. Their romance, if it could be called that, was a slow accretion of small choices. They shared quiet mornings, occasional meals, and the business of diaper bags and community events. They argued only about practical things, who would pick up the baby at daycare on days when schedules compromised, and always returned to respectful compromise. One afternoon in early spring, standing on the balcony of the small studio she now called hers, Fatima watched Gustavo toddle toward an open patch of grass under the care of a toddler sitter. He laughed, bright and uncomplicated, and turned toward her with the wide eyes of someone who thinks the world is essentially hospitable. She felt a swell of something that was not debt, but possibility. Marcelino came by that evening with 2 cups of coffee and a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that smelled of the countryside and made the apartment feel like a place that had been waited for. He did not bring headlines. He brought a willingness to be present. He said, "You're doing extraordinary things, not because I say it, but because the city notices and because people come to you." She listened. Gratitude sat in her chest like a contained warmth. "It's enough," she said. "I want it to stay enough." He looked at her for a long time, and then softly, "Would you consider moving in with me sometime? Not because you need anything, but because I want to share the load. I don't want to complicate your independence." She considered. The question was not simple. Moving in with him would not magically make everything better, and she knew that. It would, however, tilt the geometry of her day. It might mean flexibility with childcare and the possibility of less commuting. It would also mean a new degree of vulnerability. She said, "I need time. I need to see how the next months unfold. But I don't dismiss it." He nodded. It was a patient answer. It matched the rhythm they had built, consent and conversation, not rush. Life went on in that way, days of work and nights of laundry and small domestic gestures that felt like making a home. A shared recipe, a borrowed book, a quiet evening when Gustavo crawled into Fatima's lap as if she had always been there. They met challenges, insurance forms, a miscommunication with a daycare worker, a moment when a delivery failed, and handled them by talking, sometimes more than once. Eventually, on a warm late afternoon with a breeze that smelled faintly of rain, Marcelino walked Fatima to the small park near her apartment. Gustavo ran ahead and then turned to make sure they were still there. Marcelino stopped and took her hand, and this time there was no question on his face, only an invitation. "When I think back to that flight," he began, "I see it as the day things changed in a small but significant way. You were brave in the most ordinary sense." He paused, then added with a half-smile, "And you made a plane full of strangers kinder for a moment." Fatima let the gratitude and the memory sit between them. "It was nothing heroic," she said. "It was just what I knew how to do." He laughed softly. "For Gustavo and for me, it was more than nothing." They stood there, hands linked, and the child, now somewhat more grown, wobbling between their feet, made a sound that was half laugh, half claim. In that sound both of them heard an affirmation they could not quite name, a new family forming not by the incident of wealth or favor, but by the slow accumulation of care. Months later, the life that had been tentative settled into a dependable pattern. Fatima kept her job at the clinic and advanced. Dr. Elisa recommended her for a coordinating role in outreach because Fatima's record showed reliability and good judgment. The promotion came because she had earned it through work, hours, nights, patience, the ability to hold a frightened parent steady. Marcelino celebrated with a modest dinner they shared with Donna Zilda and Juliana, an evening of laughter, unpretentious joy, and a few embarrassed toasts. When asked on the street how their life had changed since that day on the flight, both answered differently and honestly. Marcelino would speak of the small human lessons he'd learned, to slow down for diapers, to let grief be messy, to value the slow knitting that care requires. Fatima would shrug and speak about shifts and schedules and the importance of showing up. Both would mention Gustavo, because children have a way of naming the future without speech. The final scene, if a story must have one, was not a crescendo, but a gentle echo of where things began. On a plane months later, this time a short flight to visit family in another city, a baby 2 rows ahead began to cry, high and insistent. A man reached for a pacifier. A woman in a plain jacket hummed softly, and another passenger looked around, the cabin filling immediately with that peculiar intensity that announces a human need. Marcelino turned and brushed Fatima's hand with his, and she smiled, an old private smile that acknowledged the memory. Across the aisle, the baby quieted as a small, practiced touch settled him. The cabin exhaled. People returned to their newspapers and headphones. Marcelino squeezed Fatima's hand and mouthed a word, "Thank you." That was both remembrance and an ordinary fact of their lives now. She looked down at their son, asleep between them on a small travel pillow, and felt the tug of a life that had begun not with an exchange of favors, but with a single, unassuming act. The plane moved forward, engines humming a present tense lullaby. Outside the window, clouds shifted like pages turning. At 30,000 feet, everyone could hear a truth. A cry calls for care, and a small kindness can change the course of days. The shy woman who had stepped forward on a crowded flight had not merely quieted a baby for a moment. She had opened a path that led to work earned, to offers made without strings, to a family stitched together by consent and mutual respect. It was not a rescue nor a surrender. It was a series of choices, one after another, that made a new life possible. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life feel-good moments, subscribe and follow their journey.